And so that's why when somebody came in here tonight and saw that the fluorescents were off, they said, it's dark in here. And so we take that for granted. These people didn't. Picture yourself in an economy where it was very expensive to light something, and all the lights went out for 3 days. They describe what happened. Nobody left their place. They all stayed inside because there's anarchy. Yes, ma'am?
Was there a god of darkness that they worshipped?
Ra, it was the god of light. So this is absolutely, it's also, if you look at it, we talked about this a little bit last time, really, really important that we're uncreating the early creation. Let there be light. And now he's uncreating the creation for these people at the same time that he is parallel destroying each of their gods' powers or humiliating each of their gods. And their main god was Ra, which is the god of sun. And if you remember, the pharaohs always have the horn with the big dish right in the middle of it. That's the sun. And so their god Ra is their big god, and they're all excited about Ra. And here is Yahweh tearing Ra down. Says Ra has no power before Yahweh. And it's a beautiful thing. He's torn down a lot of their gods through these other 8. And now he gets to 9, and he says, and by the way, that Ra guy, he's got nothing on me. And he just turns out the lights. Now, there's all kinds of speculation through textual criticism about, well, it was a very heavy overcast, yada, yada, yada. Well, you know, I don't buy any of that. And let me tell you why. If you have ever talked to an old-time sailor, Jerry, any piece of the moon is enough to give you enough light if you stay in the darkness at night. You can see the waves, you can see the islands, you can see what you need to see, you can see the land, because any piece of the moon will do it. And they say that back in the old days, sailors who pulled the night shifts could actually see by starlight. Now keep in mind that starlight would have been more visible then than now because of no light pollution. Yes, sir?
That is true, because I'm from the Caribbean, and in the early days we didn't have light in certain places, and the starlight really kept us going.
And so even on a night when it's really, really dark and all you have is the stars, the people of this era would have been able to see something because their eyes were not like ours. I mean, we spend all of our time in light except the time we have our eyes closed at night, right? And some of us have enough lights in our bedroom to actually ruin our night vision, right? And if you've ever seen movies about submarines, they all protect their night vision because they're working in semi-darkness down there. So all that is an overlay for us to understand that these guys would have been adept at nighttime work. A little candle is the brightest light that they had, a torch maybe one day. But then it says here, it wasn't just overcast. It was so dark that they could not leave their houses. So that means not even starlight. It was perfectly dark. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever been down in a cave, when they turn those lights out, your eyes freak out. I don't know about you. I've seen it happen, and my eyes cry out. It's just exactly like when things go really, really, really silent. We have so many sounds in our world, air conditioning and all these other hums and buzzes that we have. I remember when we moved from Arlington to Granbury. We had lived in Arlington 5 blocks from I-30. And there was a constant hiss of tires on I-30, a high-pitched hiss that you get used to, but it was loud. And it was all night. When we moved to Granbury, we lay down in bed the first night and we said, something is wrong. Something is really, really, really wrong. What's wrong? And we realized that it was our ears reaching out to try to find some sort of sound to get their bearings. And it's the same thing when they turn off the light in the cave. Your eyes can't get any bearings. That's exactly the way these people were. They were stuck in absolute darkness that causes you to grope around. They didn't see anyone, and they didn't rise from their place. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Okay, let's read 24 through 26.
Then Pharaoh called to Moses and said, go serve the Lord. Only let your flocks and your herds be kept back. Let your little ones also go with you. But Moses said, you must Also give us sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Our livestock also shall go with us, not a hoof shall be left behind. For we must take some of them to serve the Lord our God. And even we do not know with what we must serve the Lord until we arrive there.
Okay, so this is the negotiation, a typical Oriental, uber polite sort of negotiation. And the Pharaoh last round said, leave your children as hostages. You can go out, just the men go out. Leave your women and children as hostages and you can go out and come back. This time he says, all right, you can take your women and children, but leave your animals behind as hostages. And Moses replies very politely, well, you know, we've got to have sacrifice. Were they going to sacrifice every animal they had? Not even close, right? He was just making a polite response. What he's saying is, no, it's all or nothing. And that comment, not one hoof will remain, is really classic. Because he's saying, no, we are not negotiating at all. It's a very polite way of saying, no. Read my lips, no. We are not negotiating. So he gives the message, but it sounds strong to us, but it's very polite in their culture. So let's go 27 through 29. Whoever's ready.
But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, get away from me. Take heed to yourself and see my face no more. For in the day you see my face, you shall die. So Moses said, you have spoken well. I will never see your face again.
Okay, so this is a really interesting break, because here is Pharaoh, who thinks he's been negotiating all along. And now he's gotten the clear message, the message of something approaching a really harsh and vulgar sign. Moses is not negotiating. Moses has the upper hand here. And Pharaoh has never not had the upper hand. Pharaoh has an army. Pharaoh has lots and lots of food stored up. Pharaoh has lots and lots of animals and livestock. Pharaoh has servants. Pharaoh has a great home, a palace, more than one. And so he has never been on the short end. And so he does not know how to respond to being on the short end. And so he simply lashes out and attacks the messenger. He says, don't you come back around here or I'll kill you. Now that's exactly what you'd expect a frustrated, petulant person to say. And Moses responds appropriately. He says, so let it be written, so let it be done. You have decreed it. I will go with that. Maybe you're a prophet. Maybe that's what God is suggesting. So he says, okay, we're done. Now we're to chapter 11, so let's read chapter 11 through verse 3.
And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, articles of silver and articles of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people.
So here we saw it a little bit in the last negotiation. Remember when Pharaoh's magicians and stuff, his court, essentially said to him, dude, you're ruining us. Can you not see that this guy is a pestilence upon us? Send him away. Send them all away. We can't afford to not send them away. Keep in mind, every one of the plagues so far has inured to the pain of the people more than the pain of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is looking to keep his free labor supply. And so he has different, his interests are different from his people's interests at this point. His people are hurting badly. And so they're starting to say, man, what is it worth to keep your free labor supply? Does this sound at all familiar? Nobody think this sounds like the argument we're having in politics today? And so he says, what's it worth? His people are saying it's not worth it. Let them go. And so it turns out that the people have given a bunch of new respect to the people of Israel. And all of a sudden, they're looking at these people who are servants in their houses, who are servants in the fields, who are servants in the bricks. And they're looking at them with a new look. They say, these guys maybe don't have an inferior God like we've been thinking for the last 400 years. Maybe they have a God that's pretty amazing because their God just beat Ra. And so they're holding these Israelites in a higher esteem, a higher respect. And Moses, inspired by God, is now giving them the orders. Now is the time to take your plunder. These people are well disposed toward me and they're well disposed toward you, and they're holding their own Pharaoh in contempt at this point. If you go and ask these people for things, they will give you whatever you ask for. And what's really interesting, in a servant master environment, the servants know where the goodies are. And the servants go, yeah, I'd like that and that and that. And they're getting all the things that they had wanted all these years. And so they gather all these things. That part of the story is an extremely important part of the story because it explains what happens later when they're out in the wilderness and they have all this jewelry. They have all this wealth. They keep doing things that require jewelry and wealth, and you see it because they've carried it with them out of Egypt. They don't have slaves' wages. They have something better than that. And so we'll see that come later. So let's read verse 4 all the way through verse 8.
Then Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall be like it again. Against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue, against a man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, and all the people who follow you. After that I will go out." Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger.
Okay, so this is a little problem that people have had over the years, because in verse 29 of chapter 10 it says, Moses said, "You have spoken well, I will never see your face again." And now here we have him in verse 8 of 11 talking to Pharaoh again. The tenses, the Hebrew language has no pluperfect tense. Pluperfect is where it says, John had said. Okay? And so for those of you who don't parse verbs, I must confess that I don't parse verbs either. So I have to look this stuff up. And so pluperfect is John had said. So in this case, the Hebrew can't convey it. But very likely what the Hebrew would have conveyed, if it could convey, would be Moses had already said to him. So they're literally putting this monologue about the 10th plague into its own place with the 10th plague. But very likely he said this before get out and stay out or I'll kill you. And that would make more sense from that sense.
So like a continuation of a previous conversation.
Exactly. So Moses had also said to Pharaoh back then that this was going to happen. And of course that would make the get out, stay out, or I'll kill you a lot more plausible, because he says, I tell you what's going to happen, everybody's going to lose their firstborn. Now, it is hard to imagine losing your slave labor is a high-cost maneuver. Losing your livestock to hail and locusts and anthrax and all that is a high-cost maneuver. But losing the firstborn of every person in the country is enormous. And what? And animals. Now, what's really interesting about this, again, during the period of textual criticism, there were so many people who argued that, that this story never really happened. This is a story that was either made up or exploded by the Israelites to make it a bigger story than it really was. There are 3 different tomb inscriptions in Egypt that refer to the night of the death of the firstborn. Now, they had mythologized that night, and they talked about it as the night of the death of the firstborn of the gods. But of course, Pharaoh was a god to them. And so it's interesting that they found 3 inscriptions in different places about the death of the night of the death of the firstborn. And here is Moses talking about the midnight firstborn. There is no way to describe how horrible that plague would be. Yahweh has systematically destroyed each of their belief structures. And that's why the people of Egypt are ready for these people to go. And the only person really standing between their going is Pharaoh himself. Now we have to talk again about the question of predestination versus foreknowledge, because God makes some pretty clear statements that he's doing this to demonstrate his glory. This is an object lesson for the children of Israel, to demonstrate to them that they worship a great God. We talked a little bit about last time. This is not a morality play between Moses, heap big good, Pharaoh, heap big bad. That is melodrama, and that would work for some people, but that's not what this story is about. This story is a demonstration of God's power. It's a story on a different level. All of the people in this story, including Moses and Pharaoh, are pawns. This is a story of God versus the non-gods. And God is humiliating people who have relied for centuries on non-gods and saying, this is where idol worship gets you. And so Yahweh is saying to these people, this is where your idol worship has carried you. See if you like what real power looks like. I created the world. I'm uncreating the world for you. And that's exactly what it is. There are also a number of wonderful, what would you call them? A number of wonderful prequels to what's going to happen in the Exodus. The locusts get blown into the sea and not one of them survives. It's almost a direct recitation of the Egyptian army goes into the sea and not one of them, and it's the same sea, right? And so there are all these prequels to tell us what's about to happen, foreshadowings. All right, so we're down to verse 8 now, right? So let's do 9 through the end of the chapter.
But the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not eat you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land.
So even with the threat of losing his firstborn, and so far, don't you think Moses has built some credibility? Not one thing Moses has said has failed to happen. Not one thing. Everything he said has happened just as he said it was going to happen. And here we are, we're looking at him saying something that was extremely grievous. All we can assume is that Pharaoh thought at some level that it wasn't going to happen. But isn't that true of most of the world today? You know, this is exactly where I come down to every time. We've talked about this from time to time. I would like to challenge anybody to show me a time when somebody read biblical prophecy and predicted accurately an event that was foretold in biblical prophecy and when it would happen? I don't know of any.
Ottoman Empire.
The fall of the Ottoman Empire. But did anybody actually say that it was going to happen on that day and predict it correctly? They did. Okay, so there's one. There's one. As I look at these things, I wonder if that doesn't demonstrate that the purpose of prophecy is not for us to predict the date that things are going to happen, but for us to confirm our faith after they do. And that confirmation of faith is so important because as we look through all the Old Testament prophecies, every one of them, what does it say? 2,300 days is the longest Bible prophecy. Yes, we have that quote. And that one is past. So all of the time, date prophecies are finished. So think about this. Every one of them was fulfilled to the day. We can look back and see. And so we have absolute confirmation of God's power and faithfulness to carry out everything He said. But there's more. There are yet non-timed prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled, yes? And those prophecies foretell an end that is going to be good for friends of Jesus and bad for the, shall we call it the non-remnant? Yeah?
The other.
Okay, the other. So here we have Pharaoh, in this case, being a type of everybody on earth who has the opportunity to look at all these fulfilled prophecies, lockstep, date and time, events following in perfect succession. And then looking at the future prophecies and going, yeah, that's not going to happen. Yes?
When you think about what Paul was saying about them coming to the point of believing a lie,
Yes.
that the psychology behind that is very interesting, the product opinion and all that. You can present facts, actual facts, and people will still stick to what they've always believed in.
There's no question that we have an imperviousness to facts. All of the recent data, and they've been doing a lot of research on this in the last 20, 25 years, that we pick our opinions for reasons other than facts, and then we simply select the facts we like to go with them. And we all do it. You can complain, but it's not the right and it's not the left. We all do it. Yes?
Also tells you that you become a prisoner of your own thinking.
No question. Yes, prisoner of your own thinking. Over here.
I was thinking that I think it was too much for that said that their consciences would be seared with a hot
Seared as with a hot iron, yes. And you know, I think we all know that. If we continue to do something that we know, right, is something that God disdains, if we know that He's against pride and that we continue to brag, we can continue to brag and we'll stop feeling bad about it. If you just keep it up long enough, you'll figure out a way to rationalize around, that's not really bad, you know, because God gave me these gifts and therefore I can brag, right? And so that's absolutely true. All of those are true. The question here is, Moses is a type of all the world who is able to take, what is the old saying? The best predictor of future behavior is relevant past behavior. Right? In fact, there's a couple of marriage counselors around now that they ask this question to people who are thinking about getting married. They say, what's the thing that bothers you the most about him or her? And they say, well, you know, it's this. And the counselor simply asks them, if that never changed, would you still be happy being married to that person? Because as all likelihood, it's never going to completely change, right? Everybody who's married here knows that the warts you accepted her or him with are still there. Yes? Sadly, but true, right? And that's exactly, Pharaoh could have easily seen 10 signs already. 11 if you start with the snake and all that. You've got 11 signs so far. 10 signs so far, that's right, 10. The snake and then the 9 plagues, where God delivered exactly as he promised. And now here's a promise. And what's his response? It's not going to happen. So that's exactly where we are today. All right, so we're going to begin chapter 12, and chapter 12 begins to describe God's deliverance. Now, a lot of theologians and textual critics over the years have said, look, this is an insertion. This is clearly something that's been put in here later because it's a liturgical description of a ritual. And it's right here in the middle of an account of plagues. But if you think about it from a literary standpoint, where else would it be? It has to be here because it describes the deliverance of the people of Israel from this horrible plague that has just been finished being prophesied. So it has to be here. And he describes it here, and I think it's Moses describing it right where it should be. So I have no problem with it, but for a couple hundred years, critics used to complain about this. So let's read chapter 12, and that's a very long paragraph, so we're going to break it in half, and we're going to go down through 6. 1 through 6.
Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month every man shall take to himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight.
Okay. So he starts describing, and he says, and this would have been more common for them back in those days than it is for us, and that is he's declaring a new calendar. God is giving them a new calendar. And he says this is the first month. Now, they had a problem with their calendar. Everybody back in those days had a problem with their calendar. They all had 360 days in their calendar. And, of course, a year isn't 360 days. And that's why Ramadan moves around the calendar, because they've stuck with a 360-day calendar, as have the ritualistic Jews have kept the old calendars. And so this is an interesting one because this happens in the spring. This is Passover. It happens in the spring. We think that we equate Passover with Easter, yes? You know I have a real problem with this because Christians celebrate Easter based on a more accurate calendar, based on a 365 and a quarter day calendar, and it's always on a Sunday, Easter, and that Sunday is determined by a rule from the Pope. And I just have a problem with that, okay? It seems to me that God gave these people a calendar. And the way they fixed the 5-day problem is that they had a correction that happened every few years, so that when the calendar came too short, they would start the calendar a month later. They would skip a month and start a month later, so it was timed with the harvest of grain. Excuse me. So if the grain harvest wasn't going to be in time, because Passover has some things to do with bitter herbs that you need, and it has some things because you're doing some unleavened bread and some other things. And then the first fruits, remember, is that Sunday that we call Easter was actually the celebration of first fruits. The Passover would have been some days before first fruits. So, again, I'm call me picky if you want. I deserve it, all right? But here's my problem. If God told them how to count Passover, and therefore Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits are all together, they're tied together, shouldn't we celebrate Easter, if we're going to celebrate Easter, on the day of first fruits from the Jewish calendar? Because if we celebrate it on the day that the Pope declares it, that just weirds me out. Yeah, and of course, yeah, I get all the pagan connotations with Easter and Ishtar and all that. I get all that. Somebody said something over here?
Christmas is the same problem, really.
Christmas is a much larger problem. We know when first fruits comes, okay? So we can find first fruits in the calendar, both calendars, right? But there's nothing to give you Christmas in any calendar. That's a pure declaration by the Pope. That's done. And so I celebrate Christmas. So don't get me wrong. I like to celebrate Easter because it is a fantastic day. It's the best day to know that Jesus rose to be our first fruits. It's fantastic. I love to celebrate that. But I get really weirded out when we celebrate it on some day besides the one that it really was. And that's my problem, okay? Now, that's why Ramadan moves around. The Jews have a correction for it, and that is they wait till the harvest comes. So if the harvest isn't going to come yet that year, they'll shift it. And they have a calculation for how they do that. Every few years they shift a month. They have an extra month. And so that's fine with me. I have no problem with that. But again, I think Easter should be celebrated on the Feast of First Fruits, period. So I will not win that battle in my lifetime. And we will continue celebrating Easter when the Pope says. So there you go. So he gives them a new calendar. And he tells them that this is the calendar, and this is the way you start your year. And you start your year with this thing. And then it does this weird thing. It says, you got to have a lamb. They had no clue. I promise you, they had no clue of the foreshadowing that hangs around with this ritual. For more than 1,000 years, they had no clue. This is clearly God giving them a ritual that would not pay off for 1,400 years. Isn't that amazing? And so it is interesting to me that we see so many things in the Bible, little rules and little things that God gave to them, and we go, why in the world? Circumcision, why in the world? No shrimp, why in the world? There are all these things that we just go, why? Why? Doesn't make any sense in the 21st century. Every one of them was for a reason for somebody for some time. Every one of them. And that's exactly where we are on this, okay? This one, we saw it come to fruition. We saw this ritual become reality. Now, there's an argument. When you see a ritual become reality, do you stop celebrating it? And the answer is, I think you stop celebrating it in the sense of celebrating the ritual, and you start celebrating the commemoration of the actual event, right? I wonder if we would have a ritual if we could predict our children's birthdays before they were born. Right? You probably have never thought of this. These things don't keep you up at night. And so if we knew when we're 10 years old that we're going to have 3 dates out of the year that our children are going to be born, won't that be exciting? We could celebrate rituals on those days because we're excited about this going to happen, right? And then afterwards, then we commemorate. We commemorate those dates because we want to recognize what great thing happened that day. Our family was increased by great joy. And as I've told you all before, the lady that came to the house called him your little treasure. And we have the little treasures. And when you get a little treasure, you should celebrate that. Okay, so we're on verse 8. Is that 7? 7 through 11.
And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in the fire. And its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire, and thus you shall eat it. With a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, so you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover.
Okay, so this is a beautiful picture, and what it speaks to is people who are about to flee. It is your last supper at home before you flee. Now, these seem like weird rules to us, but they weren't at all weird to them. If you didn't have time to go through all of the butchering process of this lamb, that's exactly how you'd do it. You'd put it on a spit, you'd roast it just exactly as it was, and you'd eat it fast. You eat it with unleavened bread because you don't have time to go through the rising process, right? Have you ever thought about the people that fled Egypt taking their sourdough starter with them? I'm not playing. Seriously. Can you picture all those ladies going, don't let that get too cold? Or too hot. I guess cold is okay, right? Don't let it get too hot. And so I don't know what it would be like to think about if all of us one night had to take off on foot from our homes, carrying what we and our animals could carry. What would you take with you? Yes?
It's interesting to know that when they left Egypt, they left their houses and everything. The Egyptians got it. And the Lord worked it out that when they went into Canaan, they got
somebody else's houses.
Right. They got houses of the
interesting. Yes. Interesting. Very interesting. And interestingly enough, and I guess we won't get to it in Exodus, but in when we start with Joshua, which may be some time from now, I understand that. But when we get to Joshua, you'll see that each of the groups, and we'll start to see it in Exodus, each of the groups that were driven out wound up deserving it. Each of the groups disrespected Yahweh as the people were coming through. And each of the groups signed their own doom. Very interesting. We'll study through that. Okay. All right. So it's an interesting picture. It's an interesting story. They had no clue about what they were foreshadowing, but it was a meal on the run. And they throw in some bitter herbs. So you're going to eat some bitter herbs to remind you of bitter slavery. So it's a symbolic meal. It's a ritual meal. It's a meal. And then think about this. I always have this image in my mind of this guy sitting there with a staff in his hand, eating off of the table, right? But of course, they didn't eat on tables. They low down on the ground, right? So how do you even have your staff in your hand when you're low down on the ground? I don't know. But you got your sandals on, you're laying on the ground with the staff next to you, you're doing your eating, and you're going to not have to do the dishes. Because when you get up from this one, that is the last you're going to see of that house. Now, don't you know that would be bittersweet and frightening? And frightening. It's interesting. We see their frightenedness over and over and over once they get in the wilderness. And we'll touch on it as we see it each time. Yes?
Why the entrails?
Yeah, because they didn't have time to butcher it, is the idea. You just cook it with the entrails inside, and they would burn that in the morning. So they wouldn't eat the entrails. Some people eat organ meat, but they probably wouldn't eat the entrails. They would just eat the muscle. And then the other question, of course, is how is it that they decided how many people can eat a lamb? I guess it depends on the size of the lamb and the size of the family. But I guess they knew how to do that back in those days, which is that old story in the New Testament that says, we have killed the fatted calf. How many people does a fatted calf serve? It's a really interesting question. Have you ever read stories about the gauchos in South America? And those gauchos in South America, and they eat the cattle that they're shepherding. And so they'll go a long time eating a little bit of dried this and a little bit of dried that. But when they kill a cow, they eat real good for 2 or 3 days. They just gorge themselves. And then they go eating a little bit of nothing for a long time until they're ready to kill another cow. So it's interesting how people know how to, in those days, knew how to portion that all out. I would have no idea today how to do that. So.
Paychecks when we got married.
Yes, that's right. We do it with paychecks. Yes, but of course, I remember an old guy saying, when I was first starting out, he said, you know, 0 was the end of it. But now I figured out you can go way past 0. Yeah, so, yeah, we see that a lot. Okay. All right, let's do verse 12 through 14. Or 13, 12 through 13.
For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt.
Okay, these people had a really, really, really strong, visceral take that blood equals life. And you can see why any primitive culture would think that and see that, because when people bleed enough, they die. And they would have seen that, right? So blood equals life to them. Now, today we might say electrical activity in the brain equals life, right? I mean, we look at things a little bit differently. But of course, we still can't live without blood. And that's why throughout the Pentateuch and beyond, the drinking of blood was considered completely taboo. We were not to do that. So these animals, they took the blood, and it's a sign of life on the 3 posts of the door, okay? That's a sign of life, and that's what it's for. And this is where the word Passover comes in. At the end of verse 11, Passover, he says, because I'm going to pass over the land of Egypt on that night. And then he says it explicitly, what he's been doing through all these earlier 10. He says, I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. He's saying very explicitly what he's only shadowed at and hinted at up until now. He's saying everybody who worships an idol is going to realize that what they were worshiping was worthless. And you know, it's real interesting as you read the whole Old Testament, especially as you get to the prophets. It's the same message, isn't it? Now, why would God have such a profound, important, critical message, and then it's done? Because after they return from exile, we don't see any more idol worship. It's done. Did he really eradicate idol worship? No, that's right. And the answer is that we are all big idol worshipers. I'm an idol worshiper, you're an idol worshiper, and if you deny it, your denial is an idol. I'm sure I've told you all before, but back when I made more money than I do now, I used to love to carry around cash in my pocket. I loved having $1,000 in my pocket. What's that?
My dad used to say when he didn't have cash, I need to go to the bank, I'm feeling naked.
Yes, and that is absolutely, for me, I don't know about your dad, but for me, it's idol worship, isn't it? Because I am finding my security in green pieces of paper. Not that I have $1,000 in the bank, but I have $1,000 in my pocket. And I am finding security in the green pieces of paper in my pocket. Now, for somebody else, that may mean nothing, and it may not be an idol to them at all. They just like it because they happen to trade in cattle down at the auction, and they like to be able to pay cash for it, right? So for those people, it may not be anything. It may be a complete not heart issue. For me, major heart issue. Because I used to think, well, you know, what if I have a blowout and I need a car, I need a tire. You know, I used to drive that Ford Excursion. You know what a tire for an Excursion costs? Oh my. Those things are huge. There's more rubber in those than there are in 1,000 combs. And so I used to have that money, and I would say, you know, this is my protection against bad stuff happening. And of course, that's so silly, because the really bad things that can happen, all the money in the world won't save you from. Right? I mean, you get bad news, it doesn't matter how much money you have in your pocket, or in your bank account, or in your wherever. The fact of the matter is that it was purely security. What would you say?
What about a credit card? It's the same thing.
Oh, it's so different to me, though. So different to me. Let me tell you why credit cards are different for me. For years, one of the things I did, honestly, every day, is had people come into my office and tell me the story of why they needed a lawyer, right? And I learned really, really quickly that most of America has an unused available credit supply big enough to drown them. And what happens is one illness, one job layoff, one auto wreck, one child gets in jail, one this, one that, or one the other, and their boat is full of water. And having watched that for 25 years, those credit cards look really awful to me. Because I've seen people in not just little rowboats, but some pretty good sized boats that filled their boat with debt. In a matter of months, they can go from sinking to drowning. And I've seen it so many times that credit cards are extremely unattractive to me, just personally, because I've seen that happen. And it's just horrible. I remember this poor man. He was, I don't know if anybody has ever known a newspaper carrier. So there are kids who carry newspaper routes, and they don't make very much money, but they do it. This guy was a newspaper route maven. He had a whole section of Fort Worth that he delivered newspapers to, and he had tons of minions that actually did a lot of the deliveries for him, and he made a lot of money doing that. He had to get up early like a donut man, but he was out there every morning, and his minions were out there every morning, and I was surprised by how much money you could make delivering newspapers. And then his wife came down with cancer, and his available credit, he's just one of many, but this was a perfect example. And here's an honest, hard-working American man that went from sort of on top of the world to right in front of an impending train. And he came to me, and I wept with him because there was nothing that I could do for him except refer him to a bankruptcy lawyer. Because between the hospital bills and all the credit cards that he ran up with all that, there was nothing else he could do. And here was an honest American guy who disdained the idea of bankruptcy. But I said, brother, you've got no choice. They'll come after you one at a time until they pick your flesh clean. And so it's harsh. Anyway, I don't know how we got on that. But, because I had a problem that I like to carry around a lot of cash and found a lot of security in carrying around cash. What's that?
That can be very dangerous, having a lot of cash with you.
Yeah, not so much in America. Yeah, not so much in America. I don't go to those places. I don't go to those places. Yeah, if you flash it. Now, that's a real bad idea. Okay. I will pass over, and so we're down to verse 14, and we've got about 3 minutes. So let's do this. We're going to start with 14 next time. And so what I'd like to do is just help us to recognize that on this subject, we don't like to think of ourselves as idol worshipers. There is a really great book by a non-Adventist Christian named Kyle Idleman called Gods and Idols. Gods with a little g, which is interesting since it's the beginning of a title of a book and it's a little g. But anyway, Gods and Idols. And it really helps us to identify things like cash in the pocket, things like so many things that we rely on. I see so many young people, have a few young people, and they rely on their really good looks, right? Those are going to fail you. I'm living proof. There are so many of these things that are going to come and they're going to go. They look good now, but they're not going to look good then. So many things. Every one of them is designed by Satan to keep us from fully relying on this powerful God described in this chapter. And in my own life experience, I have seen God put plagues on my idols. I remember when I was going to school here, I had a really cute car. It was a Toyota Celica, and it had the letters GT on it. That stands for Gran Turismo. And I loved that little car. And I think I must have loved it too much, because at some point God took it away from me in an automobile accident. Just destroyed it. And it took me a couple of months of mourning to realize that I had invested too much in that car. Not money. It was an inexpensive car. I invested too much of my heart and my identity. And God sometimes runs these plagues on our idols too. And maybe it'd be better if we give them up before we have to have a plague. Would that be better? So if we identify them, we can give them up before. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, please take from us our idols. Please identify them so that we can give them up. Please share with us our investments in this world and in the trinkets and in the stuff and in the people. Please help us to separate ourselves from anything that will keep us from being fully dependent on you. We know that that's your calling to us, and we want to live within your will and within your calling. So here's our offer, Lord. If you will identify our idol, with your Spirit's guidance, we will release it. Please help us to not have to go through the plagues. Give us freedom from idols, we ask in Jesus' holy name. Amen.